What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and in today's episode of the Blueprint Only Input Buffer tutorial series, we're going to be going over Enhanced Input Part 2. And what this really is going to be covering is how to fully get away from the default input action input axis system to use our enhanced input. In the previous episode, we were able to implement enhanced input and fire the correct actions and commands when we had pressed the proper inputs from a keyboard or controller. But we technically had a reliance on our input actions and input axes in our project settings because we were mapping them based on the names of the input actions and axes and the inputs like the keys or the controls that related to them. In today's episode, we're going to eliminate that reliance, and so we will not have to have input action or axes in our game to perform commands. So again, notice that I just performed command 4, that's why I did that little animation, and command 4 also printed to the top left of the screen here. Now let's check something out. So let's go to our edit project settings and our input section where we had previously set up the input actions and input axes. Now, one of my commands in my game uses the attack button. So attack 1 in my third person tutorial series is the 1 key on the keyboard. And so I was using this in my base character blueprint when I went to my command list. Right here, my command list. This is actually command 4. So my command 4 has one input that is bound to attack. And this mapping was set up to use the input action in the project settings. So you'll notice if I am to change the name of this input action and play the game and try to perform that command, I no longer can, even when I press the proper key. And this is because the mapping is, again, the input action name and the key related to it. So it can't find that input action name at this point, in which case it cannot actually succeed with performing the command. Now, I'll go over this, obviously, in a few minutes, but I'm going to connect my enhanced input logic, or today's logic, and I am going to play this, and you'll see I can still perform the command even though the input action has changed. So with this method, we do not require the input actions or input axes in our project settings to perform commands in our command list. Thus, we've totally eliminated relying on that old system. Now, because this project is my third person and action RPG tutorial series and not just the blueprint only input buffer, I am going to go ahead and replace that. That way it doesn't screw anything up for the future for that series. But now we are ready to get started. So I want to give a huge thank you to all my Patreon members and YouTube membership subscribers, everyone who's donated, given super thanks. I really appreciate you guys. You guys are awesome, and I am so excited to continue to work on content that you guys enjoy and want to see. Now, if you want to get caught up in the series before you check out this episode, I would link you to this right here, which is part 1 of the Blueprint Only Input Buffer tutorial series, and you're going to want to watch that so that you can follow along and achieve the same result that we have in this episode you see here today. Additionally, if you're interested in what you see here from the enemies, the equipment, the damage, and whatever else you're seeing on the screen, and you decide you would like to implement some of that in your own game, you can check out the entire playlist to the third person and action RPG tutorial series right here. Now, with all that out of the way, we can go ahead and get started on today's episode. So this is a blueprint only episode, so there's no code in this one. And really, we only need our base character BP. So let's go into our base character BP and let's start in the event graph. And we're going to go to begin play. So remember, there are a few additional things I do here because this is from my third person tutorial series. So I do things like setting my game mode reference. That's not required for the enhanced input, but what you should be doing in yours if you've been following this little mini series is calling our setup input actions function. And then as of the previous episode, we were adding the mapping context to use our enhanced input system. There's one additional change I want to make in here that we didn't go over in the last episode, And instead of calling setup input actions immediately, I actually want to call it after adding the mapping context. It can take a little bit of time to add all of the inputs in the mapping context, and so to be safe, I've added a delay. That way I know we can accomplish what we're trying to do today. I'll talk a little bit more about this later in the episode. This is not necessarily required, but it will guarantee that you can actually get all your input actions from your mapping context on the first time you check, instead of having to error or potentially not perform an action right away when you want to. And so I typically try to avoid delays, but this is a good method to just make sure that everything works the first time you go to use it. Basically, what we want to do is not call setup input actions as the first thing in begin play, but instead remove that call and call it after our add mapping context logic that we set up in the previous episode. We can use a timer instead, and we can use set timer by function name. And what we can actually do is pass in the function name setup input actions. Same case and everything, setup input actions, and call it after a given time, which I will put in as 0.2 because that is what the delayed time is by default. And so we're going to call our setup input actions function once this amount of time passes. And just to show you, I have my setup input actions logic linked up here. So if I can perform an action, you'll see that it's working. And it is, in fact, working. So there you go. You have two methods here. You can either add a set timer by function name or add a delay and call the function specifically. Whatever you want to do is perfectly fine. Again, this is just a safeguard, so any delay in adding to the mapping context won't cause issues for the player or for you when testing. Now with that sorted out, let's go into the actual logic for today's episode, and we're going to handle this in setup input actions. So previously in this little mini-series, we had logic to go through all of our action mapping names, retrieve each action mapping by the name, then check the name for a certain action, such as the jump, and get the key related to that action mapping, or the keys related to that action mapping, because you may have multiple. Then I was calling an event called add to input map, which is one that we created and set up in the event graph, right here. And it takes a map variable that we made that binds a string to our enum for our e input type. Essentially, it would bind the inputs that it finds under the jump action mapping to the jump enum. And so we would know if we pressed a key or a button that was found in this map, it could fire this enum. It could say, yep, we have triggered the attack input type. But since we don't want to use those input actions anymore from our project settings and we want to use our enhanced input actions, we no longer want to do it in this method. We still want to add the inputs and the input types to the input type map, but we only want to do it for the enhanced inputs, not the input actions and input axes in the project settings. Of course, you're allowed to keep those input actions and axes in your project settings. Just know that if you want to remove any of your input actions or input axes, it will affect your enhanced input logic that you have in here. So even though you are allowed to keep them and it doesn't necessarily hurt anything right now, it could cause problems down the line. That's why we're trying to remove that dependency today. Make sure each system works on its own without relying on other systems. And so now we can go back into setup input actions, and you can see how we were doing it. We were going through each of our input actions. We were looking for the strings that we want to put in the map. So jump, attack, special action 1, special action 2, and then my forward, backward, left, and right. I'm going to keep this logic here because it's still useful if I ever want to use my input actions. But I am going to do new logic in here for my enhanced input. All right, and it is going to be similar, but it is a little bit different. So let's go over it. Now, first of all, we need to get our enhanced input subsystem. Remember that this enhanced input local player subsystem is just how we can access functions and logic within our enhanced input system. It's the same way that we were able to actually add the mapping context in the begin play function. So we're doing the same thing here in our setup input actions function. And the way we get this is by getting our controller. This is the controller of the current character because the target is self. And we're going to cast it to the player controller type specifically. Then dragging off the as player controller, we can search for this enhanced input local player subsystem. And you can see it came up very early on, but we want to get this node right here. Now, off of this node, we can call a function called query keys map to action. So query keys map to action. And this will return all of the keys that are mapped to a given action mapping. But for this to actually work, we do need to be in the proper context. That is why we added that little timer before calling setup input action. We had to make sure that we set the proper mapping context on this character. That way it can get the proper keys, because remember, one of the major benefits of enhanced input is that in different contexts, your input actions could actually change keys, or you may add or remove some input actions from that context so that they're not always present. In here, we can select our input action, and we want to go through and select each of them just like we did in the previous logic. So before, where we were searching the substring of the action mapping for something like jump, and then we were determining, oh, this is the jump action mapping. Now we're actually passing in the direct input action that we want to use. So enhanced jump. Once we do this, we will get a return value that is an array of all the key structures, and we can loop through them using a for each loop. And we can drag off the array element. This is the individual key structure of the index that we're on, and we can call get key display name. And you'll notice this is the same function that we were calling in the input action and input access logic. So at this point, we have been able to actually get the keys associated with the enhanced input action for the enhanced jump. And so now we can add it to the input map just like we were doing with the old system. All right, so this is all for enhanced jump. And we need to just call our add to input map function. So add to input map. Now, when you get this, we want to pass our key display name into it, just like we were doing before. It will automatically convert it for you. But if you want to know what this node is, this is the text to string node. So if you drag off your get key display name and type to string, you will get this node right here, and you can pass that into the input. For the type, you're going to manually select the one that you want. This is okay to be hard-coded like this because it's never going to change. If we know we're using the enhanced jump here, we can safely use the eJump type. Now, you're done with the enhanced jump. We need to do this for all of the keys. So don't drag off of this node and start the process again. Otherwise, you're going to loop through and do it more times than you need for each key, which is going to cause problems. But on completed of the for each loop, so once we've gone through all the keys associated with enhanced jump, we can go to the next action. And you can see I'm using the same enhanced input local player subsystem for the target. I have a reroute node here, and it goes below everything. And I'm calling query keys map to action again, but this time I'm using my enhanced attack 1 input action. From here, it's the same process for every single one. Just make sure that you have it all set up correctly. So we do a loop, we get the key display name, and we add to input map, but this time we choose the attack type. Then on completed of the for loop, we go to the next one, which is enhanced special action 1. We do the same thing, but set the type as special move 1. On completed of the for loop, we go to enhanced special action 2, which sets the type as special move 2. Then we have up, down, left, and right. So enhanced move up is our forward enum type. Up and forward are the same in this case. Then we have move down, which is going to be our backward type. Move left, which is going to be our left type. And move right, which is going to be our right type. Now, at this point, we have successfully changed over setup input actions to use the enhanced input logic. Before, I had setup input axes being called at the end of the setup input actions logic. I ended up disabling that because we didn't want to actually use input axes, but we wanted to use the menu up, menu down, menu left, menu right for our forward, backward, left, right with the old system. This is still the case for me, so I don't call setup input axes, but you could at the end of your final loop that you do. So once you get to the very last element here, on this completed, you could call setup input axes, and it would be called there. Although that will still use the old input axis system if you don't convert that. So there you go, that's setup input actions. At this point, you can change your names, you can remove your input actions from your project settings if you really want to, and you should still be able to perform all the commands you'd expect in your command list. We will go over setting up the input axes and enhanced input in the next episode. That one's a little bit more involved. It's the same process for this function and binding them, but grabbing the values from them can be a little bit different because enhanced input is, of course, different than just input actions and input axes. So it could be a little bit more complicated, and we don't have any input axes set up in our enhanced input. So we will go over that entire process in the next episode of this mini-series. There is one other bug I would like to fix up though, and that is in our determine command to use function. In this function, we go through our move buffer, which is the list of possible moves or attacks or commands that we are able to perform at this time. And we end up making sure that we choose the most complicated move out of those to use, because we can assume that the player is trying to perform that complicated command, or at least they got lucky enough to press all those inputs, and we should reward them by giving them the most complicated of all those commands. Once this is done, on completed of the for loop in here, we were using the move to use variable that we set up and passing the name into start command. We were only doing this if has used command is false, so if we haven't already used the command. This will actually stop us from ever using the command if has used command is true, which seems like what we'd want because we don't want to use it to interrupt ourselves, but actually the animation blueprint will take care of this, and this can cause an issue with buffering moves, where if you press an input toward the end of a move or in the middle of another move, you will go to that other command. And we don't actually want that here. That should be supported in our input buffer. So my apologies for that. I am actually going to just get rid of this branch and disable the has used command pin here. We still want to use the name to call start command, but I'm going to remove that branch and just pass completed directly into start command. And then we'll fix any issues with buffering inputs. That way we can go and buffer our commands again. So now when I come into my game, you'll be able to see I can perform all of my commands. So let's actually start from the top. We have our first one here. Watch up in the top left to make sure that I'm performing all the commands correctly. So then I have one with directionals. So forward, left, jump is command 2. You can see it printed. Then we have command 3 is hold and release. Command 4 is just the attack button. So I'm going to press attack. You can see it says command 4. I'm going to release it. It says command 3. Then we do the other part of that animation. And then we have command 5, which is a multi-input press, and I can perform that by pressing 2 keys at the same time. And you can see I got it on my first try. So there we go, guys. That's how you can use enhanced input in your blueprint only input buffer, and this is going to actually get rid of almost all the dependencies from the old system. The only one we still need to go over is input axis and input axes. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you were able to learn from this. And if you were, please subscribe. It does a ton for me, and it's completely free, so I just really appreciate it. Also, if you enjoyed this episode and would like to see more, consider following me on Patreon, YouTube membership, or just sending thanks with super thanks. It really benefits me a lot, and it benefits the series as a whole. So thank you all, and thank you to everyone who has already done it. Really grateful to you guys and really appreciate it. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community and I'll be happy to help you out. Again, it is completely free. Anyway, guys, that's all I got, so thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.